Howdy. My name is Carlos Blanton. I'm a professor of history here at Texas A&M University, and I'm so very pleased today to be able to talk to you about what Texas history has to say about early U.S. history. Now, some of you might think, well, it's Texas. What does that have to do with U.S. history? Texas is apart from the U.S., right? I mean, Texas had its own revolution. It had its own independence movement. It was an independent state for several years. Texas has its own marketing. I mean, whether you're buying a truck or chips or you're buying any other sort of product, you can't get away from the Lone Star. You can't get away from the big image of Texas. A colleague of mine has called this Texceptionalism, with apologies to Ty Cashin. So if Texas is so unique and exceptional, how is it a part of U.S. history? Well, it's my thesis today, this is my point, and this is what we're going to talk about today, hopefully in no more than 25 minutes, that the story of Texas is central to early U.S. history, in the decades of westward expansion and the buildup to the Civil War. In fact, I would argue, particularly regarding the latter point, the Civil War, Texas in the 1820s and the 1830s actually predicts what happens in U.S. history in the 1850s and the 1860s. So, let's begin. You'll be seeing slide 1 right now. Thanks to the University of Texas, North Texas Libraries for this. Texas is a frontier borderlands. As you can see from the map on the split screen, the border of Texas and how it looked in the map to early Spanish, early American, early Mexican officials doesn't quite look the way it looks today. In fact, Texas in this particular map is really defined by what it's not than what it is. What it's not is an area with a stable population and a strong local and state government. Texas was pretty stateless through much of the 18th and very early 19th centuries. And that's reflected in a lot of these administrative and political jurisdictions in which Texas isn't its own state in the Spanish colonial empire, or in Mexico's republic, it tends to be annexed to other more functional, more populated states. The Constitution of 1824 is something that we need to start with. So the birth of the Republic of Mexico happens in a decade-long revolution between 1810 and 1821. It was very bloody, lots of guerrilla warfare. It was longer than the US revolution, again, throwing off the British yoke. By 1821, the Spanish are essentially ousted from colonial Mexico. And you have colonial Mexicans, ex-colonial Mexicans trying to create a government. They go through several different iterations of a government for a few years. They briefly experiment with a monarchy, and that didn't go very well. They eventually settle on a very similar process that students of American history would recognize. They created a constitutional convention, and they created out of that process a constitution. And that constitution that they created would eventually be called the Constitution of 1824, as you can see in the split screen right now. The Constitution of 1824, and I know I'm just showing you the cover of it, and that's probably not going to make a lot of sense if you're just seeing the cover of it, but believe me, it's there. The Constitution of 1824 is very much modeled after the United States Constitution that was created in the 1780s, but it's also modeled after sort of liberal Republican efforts at constitution building from within Spain that got imported into different parts of the Spanish Empire. This constitution was really, really important in establishing a permanent sense of governance in Mexico as an early burgeoning republic. And in fact, the Constitution of 1824 would govern what we would now think of as Texas for at least the next decade or, close to a dozen years. One of the things that you need to know about Texas at this place is that from the 1800s through about the early 1820s, Texas was visited by an awful lot of European and American adventurers. Adventurers is a very friendly, colorful way to say things like pirates, land grabbers, embezzlers, runaways from the law, people who are trying to steal land, people who are trying to smuggle goods in places that they're not supposed to be trading goods, transgressors of Spanish imperial and then later Mexican law. So it was very important for the Spanish Empire and later the Republic of Mexico to do something about Texas. It wasn't empty, it was full of Native Americans who really held the sway of sort of power in that region, in what we would now call Texas. But Spain, then Mexico, were really looking to try to develop this area, to make it more than just a buffer neutral zone. They really wanted to make it a more developed part of first the Spanish and then later the Mexican government. How to do that? Well, to do that, you had to encourage settlers. So Spain and then the Republic of Mexico would encourage settlers from Mexico to come up to Texas and take land there. But that wasn't enough. They needed more settlers. So, very fortuitously, a gentleman by the name of Moses Austin came to visit the Spanish Empire by way of Texas in 1819 to pitch an idea he had about being essentially a land agent that would work for the Spanish Empire to bring American colonists to Texas to settle. Now, he passed away before he was able to fulfill that contract, and in fact, the Spanish Empire passed away, and it was the Republic of Mexico that his son Stephen F. Austin in 1821 had to negotiate with. But eventually, the Austins create a permanent colony in central Texas between the Brazos and Colorado rivers, and you see the beginnings of sort of Anglo population development, stable population development, as Mexican citizens. And it wasn't just Austin's colony. There were Europeans who came, there were other American colonists who set up contracts, there were Mexican colonists who set up contracts. Essentially, Texas was a place where you could get land for very little. All you had to do is promise to be a loyal Mexican citizen, nominally convert to Roman Catholicism, although that wasn't very enforced, use Spanish in official documents, although that was sort of iffy, and most importantly, not take up arms against the government. And for that, one got land, lots and lots of land. If one could hack a living out of it, one could keep it. And that made Texas very popular for Anglo immigration throughout the 1820s, much of it, the successful immigration, funneled by Stephen F. Austin. However, with Mexican citizenship and all of these English-speaking Protestant Anglos who come from places like Kentucky, from Connecticut, from Georgia, they were all Mexican citizens and as such were subject to Mexican politics. This brings us to the centralist versus the federalist divide in Mexican politics, as you can see from the slide right here. It's a pithy slide. It gives you a sense of the two major political parties in Mexico in the 1820s and the 1830s. So I'll let you read that slide, but I'll go into a little more detail about this divide. These two major parties, of the two, the centralists wanted a strong central government directed by Mexico City, from Mexico City. They wanted weaker state and local governments. It was a very pro-church, pro-Roman Catholicism party. The centralists support racial distinctions in Mexican citizenship. In other words, the centralists believe that maybe certain types of people with more indigenous or African descent shouldn't be full citizens the way whiter Spaniards descended families should be. In addition, The centralists wanted tightly regulated trade, directed by bureaucrats in Mexico City, and they wanted closed borders and cultural integrity. The Federalists, on the other hand, favored a weak central government from Mexico City. They didn't want Mexico City interfering in their affairs. They wanted strong local and state governments instead. They favored free trade. The freer the better. They were against the Roman Catholic Church and its sort of tightening grip on the bureaucracy in Mexico, and they favored radical equality for all Mexicans in terms of citizenship. So and they favored open immigration as well. So they favored these are clearly differences between the two parties. Now, just so you know, most Texans were Federalists and diehard Federalists. And I don't just mean Anglo-Americans who were Federalists. Most Texans, even Tejanos, were Federalists because of the ideological centering of being on the frontier vis-a-vis Mexico City and a fear or revulsion of central control by bureaucrats that you don't know that have power over you. So in a way, you can think of the Federalists a lot like the Democratic Republicans in early American history, like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. You can think of the Centralists like the old Federalist Party in American history, people like John Adams and Alexander Hamilton. Now this brings us to the Texas Revolution. Things started getting very dicey with Mexican politics by the late 1820s and the early 1830s. By the early 1830s, Centralists and Federalists were essentially having a violent political civil war in Mexico. You had tremendous instability in the government. You had the military getting very involved in coup d'etats and deposing legislators, deposing presidents. You had state governments that were trying to create more distance from the national government. It was a very, very turbulent time, and these ideological tensions were really creating havoc in Mexico. One of the chief ideological tensions had to do with this idea of race and equality. But just to give you kind of the Cliff Notes version, between 1832 and 1834, General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, who himself was a Federalist, or at least he was at that point in time, had essentially used the Mexican military to depose not one, but two Federalist presidents, and later had himself declared president. And when he declared himself president, he also switched parties and became a centralist. And one of the first things he did in 1835 was he abolished the Constitution of 1824. At that point, many parts of the Republic of Mexico started violently revolting against Santa Anna and the national government and this coup d'etat, which is why and Texas was one of those states. But that's why when you see early examples of flags in the Texas Revolution or writings from the Texas Revolution, at least the early ones in the early part of the conflict have 1824 plastered all over them, because the opposition to Santa Anna wasn't so much trying to create an independent state, at least not initially. It was really about bringing back this constitution that they wanted because it gave them, the people in Texas felt, greater levels of freedom. So this brings us to the causes of the Texas Revolution. I'm not going to go through what happened. I think most of you who are students of Texas history know what happened. You've got some big battles in San Antonio, Goliad, the Alamo, San Jacinto, and the rest of the story is that Santa Anna is defeated by General Sam Houston, the first president of the Republic of Texas, in 1836 near modern-day Houston in the Battle of San Jacinto. We're not going to talk about that. What we're going to talk about today is why did this revolt happen beyond the politics? So the politics are a reflection of these deeper forces in society. What's driving the politics to be so crazy? What's driving people to kill one another on political beliefs? Well, historians have advanced three theories. Culture clash, that's one. Immigration policy, that's two. And the third theory is slavery. We're going to talk about all these theories in the remaining time that we have, but the answer is, how does this predict, or the question is, how does this predict U.S. history in the 1850s and the 1860s? Very easy. Answering among these three causes of the Texas Revolution will show us the foreshadowing that we need to see what happens in U.S. history later on. Let's talk about culture clash first. Culture clash is an interesting argument. It's a really old argument. Early Texas historians advance culture clash. It's essentially a version of white people and mixed people or darker people or racialized people can't mix. That's essentially what it is. It's sort of a coded racial argument. I think, let's hope, most of us today would reject that kind of argument. However, if you want to take it a level further and argue that the English-speaking and the Spanish-speaking worlds had so different cultures that they couldn't really mix, that's also not true, because Spanish-speaking frontiersmen and English-speaking frontiersmen were, above all, frontiersmen. They all hated central government. They all hated being told what to do. They wanted more freedom. That's why they were on the frontier. You actually see a lot of intermarriage between English speakers and Spanish speakers in early Texas history. You see a lot of coming together in terms of politics, a lot of coming together in terms of business, a lot of coming together in all facets of life. So there's a whole lot of commingling and coming together before the revolution happened, and even during the revolution. So culture clash, while there may be something to this, yeah, it's not the most compelling reason. Let's talk about immigration policy. This gets us into the realm of politics. Well, one of the things that happened, and proponents of this theory argue that because of the April 6th law of 1830, created by the Mexican government, that curtailed Anglo immigration, almost all Anglo immigration to Mexico or to Texas, to Mexico through Texas, because of that created this instability in Texas that fomented a revolt. Well, yes, the 1830 law was highly unpopular. However, it should be said that that law didn't really curb illegal Anglo immigration, and in fact, most of the local officials and military authorities didn't do too much to curb illegal Anglo immigration. And in fact, the law itself was repealed in 1833, 2 or 3 years before the Texas Revolution. And in fact, when that law was repealed, impresario Stephen F. Austin actually saw briefly his power kind of consolidated to a certain extent in terms of the old impresario contracts. The Peace Party was on the rise. It's a complicated situation, and Austin's relationship with Mexico, he would be imprisoned very soon here, was also very complicated. But that had to do with sort of political intrigue and political drama. At the time, however, the immigration policy didn't seem very effective, and yes, it was a political flashpoint, but it was also maybe not quite the whole story. So yeah, partially, like culture clash, there may be something to that, but immigration policy itself can't really explain the Texas Revolution, and that brings us to slavery. There was a push to eliminate slavery in the 1824 Constitution that did not succeed, but however, did succeed by presidential decree by Mexican President Vicente Guerrero in 1827. However, Guerrero exempted Texas from his national presidential decree, largely based on Stephen F. Austin's lobbying efforts. Again, Austin was a very big Federalist in terms of politics. In 1827, again, the state of Coahuila, Texas, the state legislature banned slavery in its state, and it banned slave importation, more specifically. However, it banned slave importation, it didn't ban slavery. So that was eventually eased a little bit too. The national legislature banned all slave importation to Texas. To comply with these laws, Texans began calling their slaves indentured servants, contractually, but for life. And eventually, Mexican authorities created new rules and regulations and laws to try to limit indenturitude to no more than 10 years. So as you can see, slavery is a constant drama in Texas history. Take a look at the next slide here. You can see that after the United States bans the importation of slavery in the 1800s, that Texas actually becomes a big port of entry for the illegal slave trade to the United States, but also slave trade directly to Texas. Much of this slave trade went through Galveston Island, largely under the nose of Mexican officials who, as I mentioned before, as with immigration, didn't do a whole lot to curb it. Slavery thrived in Texas during the 1820s and early 1830s. Okay, slavery is important. However, what's the rest of the story? Well, obviously culture clash, immigration policy, those aren't necessarily issues after the Texas Revolution, but slavery is. Slavery becomes ever more important after the Texas Revolution. For example, look at this slide here. Thanks very much to Prairie View A&M for the last slide and to the Texas Slavery Project at University of Virginia and University of North Texas for this particular slide. In 1825 in Texas, the beginning of the Anglo settlement, you have 443 slaves in Texas. That's it. And they're really consolidated in the Austin's colony, the old 300. By 1846, you have over 30,000 slaves in Texas. By 1861, right before the Civil War, or at the beginning of the Civil War, 169,000 slaves in Texas. As you can see from this slide, slavery booms between 1837, the year after the Texas Revolution, and 1845, the year that Texas joined the United States, a 557% increase. Was slavery profitable? Yes, it was. In this time period between 1847 and 1862, the value of slaves increased 122%. It was highly profitable. So I think this gives us our answer. Yes, cultural class is important. Doesn't necessarily, for the important cause of the Texas Revolution, but it doesn't necessarily say much about U.S. history. Immigration policy, sure, you can draw some meaning from that, and it has some importance, but ultimately, the big cultural difference, the big reason for stopping immigration has to do with the third reason, has to do with slavery. Here you see in Texas a foreshadowing in the 1820s and the 1830s of what's eventually going to happen in the United States, in U.S. history in the 1850s and the 1860s. The institution of slavery dominating politics and growing exponentially until it becomes the dominant issue. Wealthy people with power and money sought to preserve the status quo, sought to preserve their plantations, sought to preserve their slaves. And they convinced themselves and they convinced others that the right to oppress by the color of one's skin, by race, was just as important as any other right as American citizens. And what you're seeing in Texas is you're seeing a beginning of that. So I hope you enjoyed this little sort of theoretical detective work. I know that U.S. history is highly complex and complicated. There are many issues besides slavery, but one of the interesting things about the first half of U.S. history, particularly as you get in those decades before the Civil War, is that increasingly slavery, because of sectionalism, because of politics, really becomes the dominant issue. And you can see what's happening in the United States in the 1850s and in the 1860s with what's happening with the Texas Revolution in the 1820s and the 1830s. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed it.